U.S. and Chinese flags side by side, container ships at port, diplomats walking into talks in Singapore, headlines flashing, trade talks resume, tariffs on the table, supply chain reset. After months of rising tensions and economics certainly, the United States and China are back at the negotiating table. This week, top officials from both countries are meeting in Singapore in a high-stakes effort to ease tariffs, stabilize supply chains, and avoid a deeper trade war. U.S. China trade talks, July 2025 Singapore Summit. Why the talks matter now? Factory floors, shipping delays, inflation headlines, closed retail stores. The talks come at a critical moment. Global supply chains are still reeling from post-pandemic disruption, geopolitical flashpoint, and rising protectionism. Both Washington and Beijing are under pressure not just economically but politically. In the US, inflation has cooled, but consumer prices may remain high, especially for goods like electronics, clothing, and cars, much of which rely on Chinese manufacturing. US imports over $500 billion in goods from China annually. And in China, a sluggish economy, youth unemployment, and falling exports have put pressure on President Xi Jinping to open new markets and reduce tension with Washington. Economists say that this is not just about trade, this is about trust, resilience, and who shapes the global economy for the next decade. What's on the table? Trade representative shakes hands, charts showing tariffs, cargo being loaded. The two sides are reportedly discussing rolling back some Trump-era tariffs, protecting U.S. intellectual property, stabilize semiconductor and rare earth supply chains, agreements around green tech and clean energy investment. Timeline of U.S.-China tariffs since 2018. Many of the current tariffs date back to the Trump administration's trade war, and while Biden has kept most of them in paper, business in both countries are calling for relief. American companies argue that the tariffs are effectively a tax on consumers, while Chinese firms are struggling with reduced access to Western tech. Political tensions behind the scenes. Capitol Hill, South China Sea, naval patrols, Taiwan flag, TikTok protesters. But trade is not the only issue. The talks are taking place against a backdrop of rising political and military tensions. US lawmakers remain deeply critical of China's policies on Taiwan, Hong Kong, and human rights. There's also continued concern over Chinese cyber poisons and the use of platforms like TikTok. China, meanwhile, accused the US of containment strategies and interference in its internal affairs. Foreign policy analysts say that these trade talks are happening in a climate of mutual suspension. That's why even small agreements matter. Business and global impact. Wall Street traders, Chinese tech hubs, factories researching and restarting. For global business, these talks could have real consequences. A positive outcome could lead a lower prices, better tech, cooperation and more stable markets, but failure could trigger new tariffs and stock markets volatility and further decoupling between the world's two largest economies. Global trade volumes 2020 to 2025 trend line. Countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico already benefiting from US funds relocating out of China are watching closely. What happens next? Diplomatic roundtables, press briefings, Biden and Xi archival clips. Officials on both sides have signaled a cautiously optimistic tone with more rounds of talks expected later this year, potentially during the G20 summit. Still, experts warn that real progress will depend on political will, not just economic logic. With a US election looming and excite tightening control at home, the window for both agreements may be narrow, but it's not closed. Cargo ships sailing, flags waving, and handshake freeze frame. The US and China don't have to agree on everything, but the world needs them to coexist economically. Because when these two giants talk, everyone listens. US China trade talks, fragile pitch, or new chapter. Subscribe for global economy updates, geopolitically, diplomacy breakdowns, and more.